Now, after the Zhou dynasty, we move from what I like to refer to as a unipolar world to a multipolar world. What this means is that the Zhou dynasty from about 1050 to 750 BC was more or less the only game in town. What do I mean by only game in town? It was the only game in town, it was the only dynasty state that we see using the Chinese script to produce recognizably Chinese cultural products such as bronzes, and creating the sort of text, those narrative text with stories and explanations about the world and political legitimacy. They're the only ones really doing that. Are there other peoples around them? Absolutely, but they haven't left the literary traces that the Zhou dynasty has or the institutions that the Zhou dynasty was bequeathing to later states. After the Zhou begins to weaken in the 8th century BC, you start to see a lot of successor states crop up. They often begin with minor aristocratic elites who are getting more and more autonomy from the central Zhou court, and then they begin to set up their own states. They don't usually try to overthrow the Zhou dynasty, but they'll increasingly start to try and say, we are contending with one another to be the defender, the protector of the beleaguered and weakened Zhou king. So that's sort of the environment that we have, and that's going to subsist really for the next 500 years until you get to the creation of the First Empire in 221 BC. As these states multiply, they begin to fight with one another, and from the 5th century to the 3rd century, you have what is known as the Warring States era. It's just more heightened warfare that's already been going on for several hundred years among states that all regard themselves as civilized, and yet they think that they alone deserve the mantle of the chief protector of the Zhou king, until one of them finally defeats all the others and says, I will finally overthrow the Zhou king and set up a new state and call myself an emperor, something that's transcendent beyond kings. Now, it's during this period, a little bit later, but generally the same backdrop, from about the 6th to 3rd century BC. We have the rise of, or the appearance of multiple philosophers representing different schools of thought, all of whom are trying to define civilization, what it means to be civilized, discourses of political legitimacy, what makes a just king, who's going to be the successor to the Zhou or the defender of the Zhou king, what makes someone virtuous, what is barbarism as opposed to civilization, how do we regulate human relationships properly to create a harmonious society and a just government. Society and state are becoming much more complex and messy and bloody during these centuries, the second half of the first millennium BC, and this is when you see the rise of the classical philosophers, which culminates in the creation of the first emperors. All of these philosophers are trying to gain the ear of one of the rulers who is contending to claim the mantle of successor or protector of the fatally weakened Zhou dynasty. So let's go through 6 of them. As you know, we can't go into each one extensively for the limited time we have here. I have another lecture entirely on the Chinese philosophers, but here we'll just touch very briefly on the major points of 6 of the philosophers that will spring up during this period and leave an enduring impact on later Chinese history. The first is the most famous, Confucius. 6th century to 5th century BC. He leaves behind a text called the Analects, preserved by his followers, which is a bunch of disjointed, often seemingly somewhat disconnected statements, pithy statements and observations about the world, things that happen in Confucius's life, and his observations about what this all means, usually very vague, very cryptic, and open to subjective interpretation. Nevertheless, some big ideas come through that will be enduring and extrapolated upon by later philosophers. We see the beginning of filial piety, the idea that there is a strict social hierarchy in society. Each family, everyone should know their place, both their privileges and their responsibilities to those around them, those above them, those below them, men over women, elder brothers over younger brothers, fathers over sons, and every single family is regulated according to this, and so on for the whole village, the whole province, the whole empire, and the king himself is filial to heaven. And so everyone knows their place. Is a very attractive philosophy, ideology for anyone in power, because if people accept it, they don't always accept it, but if they do, in theory, they know their place, and they will be fairly pliant subjects for the state. Confucius will talk a lot about ritual, or the rites. This is the means by which human relationships and political relationships should be governed. How do you actually treat other people? What sort of rituals throughout your life, coming of age ceremonies, weddings, funerals, these sorts of things. The Confucians will become ritual specialists in how to navigate complex human relationships, the tensions of human relationships. Confucius talks a little bit about that as well. He also talks about the idea that when you practice rituals, there needs to be true feeling behind it, benevolence or humanity, the Chinese character Ren. And someone who does all these things is a civilized gentleman. The ideal of the Confucian gentleman is something we first see with Confucius as well. Following Confucius, we actually get a challenge to him, an alternative. This is Mozi in the 5th century BC. He's not into filial piety. He actually uses logic. Confucius, you didn't really see a whole bunch of logic in his Analects. Mozi is going to use narrative logic to argue against filial piety, saying that filial piety creates a world of partial people who look after only their own families and ignore everyone else. My alternative is universal love, in which you treat everyone like your own family member. If we do this, all villages will be at peace because we can trust our neighbor as much as we trust our father. At a larger level, all states will be at peace because if we treat other states like our state, we won't go to war with them. This is his alternative, universal love, known as jian'ai in modern-day Chinese, sometimes also translated as impartial caring. Here we're also getting the beginning of some populist content of what it means to have political legitimacy. You need to look after the common people in some way, whether that's going to be filial piety, the emperor and his obligations to the people below him, or universal love, your obligations laterally to other people in your society. Nevertheless, we're seeing the philosophers express the idea of what it is to be virtuous. Somehow, it's treating the people well, creating social harmony. Mozi was very famous. He's now in the Warring States era, 5th century. The Warring States era has exploded in full force, warfare everywhere. Mozi is very famous for arguing against offensive warfare. He says offensive warfare is immoral, and we should be against offensive warfare of any sort, although he'll make a hypocritic exception for rulers who still want to go to war and employ him as their advisor. He'll say, nevertheless, there is such a thing called punitive punishment, when signs from heaven can be interpreted by me that will tell you that that is an immoral ruler and you have the right to overthrow them. Following Mozi, we get Mencius. Mencius, I sort of like to think of him in the 4th century BC, right after Mozi, as rescuing Confucian ideas from the attack of Mozi. And yet he's going to borrow a lot of Mozi's idea to flesh out sort of the threadbare bones that we saw on the Analects, the early Confucian ideas, where we have ideas, but they aren't really fleshed out. Mencius is what most people, his interpretation of Confucius is what most people are thinking of when they think of Confucian ideas. It's actually what Mencius said about Confucian ideas. And Mencius was a master of what I deem the emotionally powerful anecdote. He wanted to prove that human nature was good, that the social hierarchy, the unequal social hierarchy, was just, that's filial piety, and that the basis of virtue, political virtue, is treating the people well. But he wants to do that in filial piety form, not in universal love form. And one of his most famous emotionally powerful anecdote is known as the parable of the boy in the well, in which he says, one day you're walking down the street, you see a boy about to fall into a well. Even if later on you decide you don't like that kid and you hope he falls down to his death, your first impulse, you can't even help yourself. It's to go rescue him. That means you're good. That means you're good. In spite of yourself, you are good. You just need someone like me to bring that goodness out of you. This is called command moralism. Just do it. I can help you just be a good person. And if you are good, you justify having unequal treatment in life because you've realized your goodness and you're helping a greater number of people have better lives, and that justifies the unequal hierarchy. That's the basis of virtue that lifts people up, gives them social mobility and the perks that come with social mobility. You recognize your obligations to other people to do good in this world in a finely graded form of filial piety. He rejects universal love of Mozi as unnatural. At the same time as Mencius, 4th century BC as well, we have Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is one of my favorite philosophers. He pretty much says all the other philosophers, you need to ignore what they say because they're all playing around with words, manipulating words, and what really is going on is you need to understand that humans only have one perspective on the world. We have one perspective on the world, and if you start looking at the same phenomenon from different perspectives, we'll realize that there's no objective truths, really, that our brains can grasp. Zhuangzi is a proponent of what we refer to as philosophical Daoism, another major philosophical school of thought, distinct from that of Mozi, distinct from Confucianism, in which the emphasis is all about questioning what you know, what you think you know. How do you know what you know? And said, this is the human perspective on something. What is the perspective of a rabbit? What is the perspective of a fish? And you realize that everyone has different ideas of beauty. Everyone has different ideas of what constitutes good food, a good place to sleep. Some organisms have never experienced summer because they're only alive during the winter, and vice versa. He's very famous for his butterfly dream. I woke up, was it a butterfly dreaming it was Zhuangzi, or Zhuangzi dreaming that I was a butterfly? And he attacks the artificiality of words. He says, as long as the Confucians and the Mohists and all these other people can keep debating, then that just shows how words can be manipulated. Only when debate is no longer possible do you know that you are perceiving some sort of enduring reality, enduring essence of the world. But famously, the most famous Taoist philosophical text, the Tao Te Jing, classic of Virtue and the Way, opens up with the line that says basically, the way that can be spoken of is not the true way. The name that can be named is not the true name. Once you start to use human words and your own limited perspective to describe something, you've already failed. It's some sort of primordial perception that you have to try to get to that spot of understanding. You can't get it through the usual means that humans perceive our reality on its own. After this, we have two more philosophers. We have Xunzi. I think Xunzi is 3rd century BC. We're at the end of the Warring States era, on the eve of the unification of the First Empire. Xunzi is the most complete Confucian, but he's forgotten oftentimes because he said, in a bad career move, that man is evil, unlike Mencius, who said that man was good. However, you get beyond that, Xunzi actually fleshes out Confucian ideas to their most sophisticated degree. He really goes into great detail on what to him are the virtues of inequality, which is essentially based on filial piety and people knowing their positions in life, which are unequal. The utilities of ritual, why it's so important to have the various ceremonies in life, do the funeral properly, or you won't be able to regulate dangerous emotions and tensions and grievances throughout life and all of your human relationships. And the transformative power of education. To Xunzi and all the philosophers, really, culture, civilization is not something that is inherited racially at birth. It is an acquired set of practices that anyone, Chinese or otherwise, can cultivate and become civilized. That's going to be important for later in Chinese history. Finally, right after Xunzi is Han Feizi. He represents the legalist school of thought. Han Feizi is trying to adapt Confucian ideas of Xunzi, man is evil, but also it's very important to have rituals in life, the transformative power of education. He's going to adapt that to the bureaucratic needs of the first empires, which are going to be created right after he dies. He's already seen that pretty soon one state's going to beat all the others. It's going to have it's going to need a bureaucracy that is unprecedentedly large. The emperor can't possibly use his charisma anymore to be able to keep his officials in line or personal connections. They're going to be total strangers. How are we going to do this? We need to take Xunzi's rituals governing human relationships, turn them into strict laws in government where everyone knows their place. Everyone has a job description. You have to do exactly what your job description says. You can't go one step beyond your job description, even for what you might think is a good thing for the government, going above and beyond. He doesn't want people who go above and beyond. These are the laws, and if you do it, you will be rewarded. If you don't, you will be punished. Very strict. What we're seeing is the creation of a centralized administration, and the legalists like Han Feizi will have a big part in defining what exactly the legal code of subsequent Chinese empires are going to be like. 221 BC, you get the creation of the First Empire. The Warring States era is over. This is the Qin Empire. It only lasts for 15 years, but then you get the Han Empire, which will last for 200. So roughly speaking, from 200 BC to 200 AD, you've got your first empires, the Qin and then the Han. And they will undertake many innovations that we haven't yet seen before and that we can see as constituting the inauguration of the imperial age. A standardized script. They're going to standardize the script. Each region previously had its own version of the script. They're going to be standardized now for the first time. They're They're going to standardize weights and measurements so that all the marketplaces are using the same thing. You're bringing diverse regions into a single standardization. They're going to impose an intellectual orthodoxy. The Han Dynasty in particular will say we're going with Confucianism, not just any Confucianism, the Mencius interpretation of Confucianism. Man is good. You just need someone in power who is more intelligent than you and hardworking to bring your goodness out. That's going to be the state and the Confucian scholars that we employ. And filial piety is the inequality of society is a good thing, and we will uphold that. The emperor, the king, will get a new title instead of individual kings. Now they come up with a new title, Huangdi, the transcendent D. There's that D from the Shang dynasty, right? It's back. The emperor now has a sort of like the Persian king of kings. You need a title above kings because the state is much bigger than that. The empire is bigger than any single previous state. And then finally, public infrastructure. Roads are going to be created, thousands of miles of roads that connect all of these regions in China. You're going to be bringing together many of the walls. Those walls are going to be increasingly important, such as the Great Wall, which is kind of a myth, but there's many, distinct different walls that'll be sort of connected together. Those will be very important because you're going to start seeing the rise of northern nomads make their appearance in Chinese history as well. We'll get to that in our next segment on the Great Southern Migration and the creation of distinct northern and southern ecosystems in Chinese history and the implications of that.